Black Hills, Dakota Territory, August 1883. The heat was a promise and a threat. The same sun that baked the prairie sod to iron would soon abandon it to a desolation of ice. Lars Jensen felt it on his skin, a different language from the damp, forgiving sun of his native Denmark. Here, the light was sharp, the horizons were endless, and the consequences for miscalculation were absolute. He stood on the slight rise of land the agent had sold him for a song, a parcel of earth nobody else wanted, too far from the creek and too exposed to the wind. Beside him, his 7-year-old daughter, Ilara, clutched a fistful of black-eyed Susans, her small face already etched with a solemnity that did not belong on a child. They were all that was left of their family, a 2-person island in an ocean of grass. The town of Providence, a day's walk away, was a testament to American optimism and haste. It was a place of freshly sawn pine, the scent of which hung in the air like a constant declaration of progress. The men there built with logs, felled from the hills. They built tall and square, houses that stood up and defied the landscape, monuments to their own tenacity. A proper house, they called it. A house with a sharp-peaked roof to shed the snow, with glass windows to catch the light, and a great stone hearth to fight the winter. Lars had spent a week there, seeking work, and had seen these houses. He had also seen the prodigious stacks of firewood piled against their walls, mountains of fuel that represented a summer of back-breaking labor. He had listened to the men talk in the general store, their voices confident and loud. They spoke of the coming winter as an enemy to be fought, a siege to be endured. Their strategy was one of brute force. Burn enough wood, and the cold would be kept at bay. Lars had done the calculations in his head, his hands, calloused from years of working dikes and shipyards, tracing invisible lines in the air. The cost of the logs, the glass, the time it would take to build such a structure. He had none of it. His wife's passage, and then her sickness, had consumed their meager savings. All he had was this plot of land, a strong back, a sharp spade, and the quiet, stubborn knowledge of his ancestors. A knowledge that whispered a different truth. You did not fight the winter. You did not fight the sea. You did not fight the earth. You made an ally of it. You yielded to its strength in a way that borrowed its power for your own. He looked not at the distant trees, but at the ground beneath his feet. He knelt and plunged his fingers into the soil. It was dense, dark, and woven with a mat of grass roots so thick it was like trying to tear a woolen blanket. This was not mere dirt. This was a building material. In the old country, they had built dikes of this, walls that held back the fury of the North Sea. The sea was a relentless beast, pushing, always pushing. A wooden wall would splinter. A stone wall would eventually be undermined. But a wall of earth, properly shaped and seeded with grass, became stronger with every wave that struck it. The pressure compacted it, the water fed the roots, and the roots wove themselves into an unbreakable, living shield. His plan began to form, not as a blueprint on paper, but as a feeling, a deep, instinctual certainty. He would not build up, into the teeth of the wind. He would build down, into the calm, unwavering warmth of the earth. He would not build a house of dead wood, but of living sod. A house that would not fight the winter, but embrace it. A house that would wear the snow as a blanket. He chose a spot where the prairie swelled into a gentle slope. Here, he would dig. He marked out a rectangle, larger than any log cabin he could have afforded, and began to cut into the prairie's skin. The work was brutal. His spade, a tool he had brought from the other side of the world, was his only companion. The blade would ring as it sliced through the dense network of roots. He learned to cut the sod into large, heavy bricks, each one a foot thick and 3 feet long, impossibly heavy with soil and life. These he stacked carefully to the side. They were not waste, they were his walls. Day after day he dug. The hole deepened, first to his knees, then to his waist, then to his chest. Ilara played nearby, a silent observer, creating small worlds with pebbles and twigs. She seemed to understand the gravity of her father's task without needing words. Her presence was a quiet fuel, a constant reminder of the stakes. They were digging for their lives. As the dugout took shape, a pit 4 feet deep into the earth, the first rider came by. It was Silas Croft, the man who owned the largest ranch in the county and had built half the structures in Providence. He was a man whose confidence was as wide as the brim of his hat. He reined in his horse, a fine chestnut that snorted at the raw scar on the landscape. "Jensen!" Croft called out, his voice carrying an easy authority. "What in God's name are you doing?" Lars paused, leaning on his spade, sweat stinging his eyes. "I am building my house, Mr. Croft." Croft chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. He dismounted and walked to the edge of the pit, peering in. "You're digging a grave is what you're doing. You can't live in a hole in the ground. This isn't the old country." "The earth is the same everywhere," Lars said, his English careful and deliberate. "It is warm in the winter and cool in the summer." "It's also wet," Croft countered, kicking at a pile of the excavated sod bricks. "First big rain, this thing will be a mud pit. First big snow, the weight will collapse whatever roof you think you can put on it. You'll bury yourself and that little girl alive." He gestured with his chin toward Ilara. "She deserves a proper house, man. A roof over her head, not under her feet." Lars did not get angry. He simply looked at the sod brick Croft had kicked. He saw not mud, but a tightly woven fabric of roots, stronger than any mortar. "The roof will be strong," he said. Croft shook his head, a look of genuine pity mixed with contempt on his face. "Listen to me. I know this land. I've been building here for 20 years. You need logs, a steep pitch on the roof, a foundation of stone. This is folly. Jensen's folly." The name was spoken, and it would stick. Croft mounted his horse. "Don't say I didn't warn you. When the first snow flies, you'll be begging for a spot by my fire, if you're not already dead." He rode off, leaving the pronouncement hanging in the quiet air. He was not wrong, by the standards of this place. He was an expert in a traditional field, his wisdom earned through 2 decades of success. His log homes stood, his barns were sound. He represented the collected, proven knowledge of the community. What he saw was a desperate, ignorant foreigner making a fatal mistake. He saw a liability. The story of Jensen's folly spread through Providence like a prairie fire. It became a source of grim amusement. Men at the saloon would buy each other drinks and toast to the crazy Dane digging his own grave. Women would watch Ilara with pity when Lars brought her to town for supplies, whispering about the poor, motherless child being raised by a madman. No one offered help. To help would be to endorse the madness. They isolated him not with malice, but with a collective, confident certainty that they were right and he was profoundly, dangerously wrong. Lars heard the whispers. He saw the looks. He felt the cold shoulder of the community, but it did not deter him. Their skepticism was a wind he had to lean into, nothing more. He had a different set of principles, learned from a different master. His master was the relentless pressure of the North Sea and the deep, abiding wisdom of the earth itself. He laid a floor of flagstones he hauled from a dry creek bed a mile away. Then he began to build the walls up from the edge of the pit, using the sod bricks he had so carefully excavated. He laid them like stones, grass side down, staggering the joints. The walls rose, 2 feet thick, dense and solid. He framed a single door and 2 small windows on the south-facing side, the side that would drink the low winter sun. The largest and most crucial task was the roof. For this, he needed timber, and he spent a week hauling cottonwood beams from the distant creek, the only wood he would use. These he laid across the top of the sod walls, close together, creating a sturdy frame. Over the beams, he layered thick planks he had managed to purchase. And then, the real work began. He started laying the sod bricks on the roof, fitting them tightly, grass side up this time. He was not just piling dirt on his house. He was creating a living system. He was orchestrating a symphony of soil, roots, and grass. The first layer was thick, heavy, packed down. The second layer went on top, its seams offset from the first. He beat it down with the back of his spade, compacting it, wetting it to the layer below. The roof was not steep like the ones in town. It had a gentle, almost imperceptible slope, just enough to guide the rain, but not enough to cause erosion. It was over 2 feet thick. The men in town who rode by to gawk at his progress laughed harder than ever. The weight was preposterous. Croft had declared that the first heavy snow, the wet, cement-like snow of early winter, would apply a pressure of 50 pounds per square foot. He calculated that Lars's roof would be bearing a load of several tons, a weight that would surely snap the cottonwood beams and crush the inhabitants. It was a mathematical certainty. Their calculations, however, were missing a critical variable. They saw a pile of inert materials, wood and dirt. They saw a static load. Lars saw a dynamic, living structure. The narrative pauses here because to understand what happened next, you cannot think like Silas Croft. You must think like Lars Jensen. You have to understand the physics of survival that the quiet Dane knew in his bones. A conventional log cabin, the pride of the frontier, was a thermal catastrophe. It was a structure designed to leak heat at an astonishing rate. Wood, for all its strength, is a poor insulator. A 6-inch thick pine log has an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of about 8. A modern, poorly insulated wall has an R value of 11. But the logs were not the main problem. The real villain was air. Every gap between the logs, every crack in the chinking, every drafty window frame was a highway for precious heat to escape into the infinite cold outside. The massive stone fireplace, the very symbol of warmth and security, was the greatest traitor of all. It operated on the principle of draw, pulling air to feed the flame. For every cubic foot of superheated air and smoke that went up the chimney, a cubic foot of frigid outside air had to be pulled into the house through those countless cracks and gaps. A family in a log cabin wasn't just heating their home, they were attempting to heat the entire Dakota Territory, one armful of firewood at a time. They were in a constant, losing battle against the laws of thermodynamics. Lars's sod house, on the other hand, was a fortress of thermal physics. It was a system built on 3 pillars of natural engineering: geothermal stability, insulation, and thermal mass. First, the geothermal stability. By digging 4 feet into the earth, Lars had placed the majority of his living space below the frost line. The temperature of the earth, a few feet below the surface, remains remarkably constant year-round. In the Dakota Territory, this temperature hovers around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. While the air outside might plummet to 40 below zero, the ground itself would be working to warm his home to a balmy 55 degrees. He was not fighting from a baseline of absolute zero. He was starting from a position of relative warmth, a gift from the planet itself. His little iron stove didn't have to raise the temperature by 110 degrees. It only had to raise it by 20. Second, insulation. Silas Croft saw 2 feet of dirt. Lars saw a composite material of staggering efficiency. The dense soil provided a barrier, but the true magic was in the tightly woven web of prairie grass roots. This matrix trapped millions of tiny pockets of air. Trapped, unmoving air is one of the most effective insulators known. Furthermore, the sod itself contained moisture, which, when it froze in the outer layers, created a crystalline structure that also trapped air. The final touch, the master stroke, was the snow itself. When the blizzards came, a thick blanket of snow would accumulate on the low-sloped roof. Croft saw this as a crushing weight. Lars saw it as a perfect, final layer of insulation. 6 inches of fresh, fluffy snow can have an R value of 10. A 4-foot drift could provide an R value of 80, creating a barrier against the cold that was more effective than any modern, commercially built home. The storm that was his enemy's greatest weapon became his own home's greatest shield. Finally, and most profoundly, was the principle of thermal mass. This was the concept most alien to the builders of Providence. A log cabin had very little thermal mass. The air inside was heated, but the walls themselves remained cold, constantly sucking warmth from the room. It was like trying to stay warm by wrapping yourself in a thin sheet of ice. Lars's house was the opposite. It was a thermal battery. The 2-foot-thick sod walls and the even thicker roof represented an enormous mass of material. During the day, the small, efficient iron stove would heat the air, but it was also heating the walls and the packed earth floor. This mass would slowly, patiently absorb the heat, storing it deep within itself. When the fire in the stove died down at night, the house did not instantly grow cold. Instead, the walls, now warmer than the air, would begin to radiate their stored heat back into the room. They would breathe warmth all night long, maintaining a stable, comfortable temperature. It was a slow, gentle, and incredibly efficient cycle of charging and discharging thermal energy. The structural integrity that Croft so confidently dismissed was also a product of this misunderstanding. He saw dirt, which can turn to mud. Lars saw sod, a living textile. The root system of the prairie grasses, particularly species like big bluestem, could penetrate 6 feet into the soil. When he cut his bricks, he was cutting out sections of a woven mat thousands of years in the making. As he laid them on his roof, grass side up, he knew what would happen. The fall rains would come, and the grasses, their sleep only briefly disturbed, would awaken. Their roots would begin to grow again, weaving down into the layer below, stitching the entire roof into a single, seamless, living entity. It wouldn't be a pile of bricks waiting to collapse. It would be a self-repairing, reinforced structure, a green shield that would only grow stronger with time. The weight of the snow would not break the beams. It would be distributed across this entire living membrane and down the massive 2-foot-thick walls directly into the earth. It was a structure in harmony with the forces of gravity and weather, not in defiance of them. By October, the house was finished. From a distance, it barely looked like a house at all. It was a gentle mound on the prairie, a green hillock with a single door and 2 small south-facing eyes. A thin curl of smoke rose from a simple stovepipe that poked through the top. Lars had spent the last weeks of autumn gathering what firewood he could, but his pile was a fraction of the size of those in town. He did not need a mountain, he only needed a spark. The winter arrived not with a gentle fade, but with a sudden, sharp blow. The temperature dropped and the first snows came. Inside the sod house, a strange magic was at work. It was quiet. The howling winds that rattled the log cabins in Providence were just a distant whisper here. The cold that seeped through the chinking of his neighbors' homes could find no purchase on his earthen walls. His small stove provided more than enough heat. At night, he would let the fire burn down to embers, and the house would hold its warmth until morning. Ilara, who had shivered through the previous winter in a drafty boarding house, slept soundly in a small bed in the corner, cocooned in a profound and peaceful warmth. The winter deepened. It was a hard one, the old-timers would later say, the kind that tested a man's soul. The snow piled up. In town, the men were burning through their wood piles at a ferocious rate. The work of chopping and hauling was endless. The cold was a physical presence in their homes, a predator that huddled in the corners and crept across the floor. Then came January 12th, 1888. The day began with a strange, deceptive mildness. The sky was overcast, the air still. Children went to school in their light coats. Farmers were out tending to their stock. But in the north, a monster was gathering itself. A wall of black sky, moving at an impossible speed, swallowed the horizon. The temperature plunged, not by degrees, but by tens of degrees in minutes. A warm afternoon turned into a polar nightmare. The wind struck like a physical blow, carrying a torrent of snow so fine and dense it was like being sandblasted with ice. Visibility dropped to zero. The world vanished into a screaming, white vortex. It was the storm that would forever be known as the school children's blizzard, a meteorological horror that caught the entire territory by surprise. In Providence, chaos and terror reigned. Men fought their way from barns to houses, unable to see their own hands in front of their faces. Log cabins that had seemed so sturdy became fragile shells against the storm's fury. The wind, hitting speeds of over 60 miles an hour, forced its way through every crack, turning homes into wind tunnels. The fine, flour-like snow was pushed through keyholes and under doors, accumulating in drifts inside the houses. Families huddled around their stoves, feeding them constantly, yet the cold deepened. The walls were radiating a killing chill. The heat from the fires was being stolen by the wind as fast as it could be produced. Silas Croft was in his house, the best-built house in the county. He had used seasoned logs, the tightest chinking, a fieldstone foundation, yet he was cold. He could feel the drafts cutting across the floor, chilling his feet to the bone. His wife and 2 sons were wrapped in every blanket they owned, their faces pale in the flickering lamplight. The roar of the wind was deafening, a constant physical pressure on the walls. He kept feeding logs into the great stone fireplace, logs he had spent all summer cutting and splitting. He watched them burn, orange and bright, and felt almost no warmth. The chimney was drawing the heat out of the room, and the wind was driving the cold in. He felt a flicker of fear, a profound sense of helplessness. The fortress he had built, the symbol of his mastery over this land, was failing. 5 miles away, on a wind-swept rise, Lars Jensen's sod house was experiencing a different reality. When the storm hit, the first indication was a sudden darkening of the light from the small windows. Then the sound began, not the terrifying roar that Croft was hearing, but a deep, low hum, the sound of a great beast passing far overhead. There were no drafts. The wind could find no purchase on the low, rounded mound. It flowed over the structure as if it were a natural hill, a part of the landscape designed for this very purpose. The snow began to pile on the roof. 1 inch, then a foot, then 2 feet, then 4. It buried the house completely, leaving only the stovepipe poking out like a tiny periscope. Silas Croft's greatest fear, the crushing weight of the snow, was realized, and it was the final, perfect element of Lars's design. The house was now entombed in a massive dome of nature's finest insulation. Inside, the world fell silent. The storm disappeared. The temperature, which had been a comfortable 68 degrees near the stove, stabilized. Lars let the fire burn low. There was no need to fight. The house was doing the work. The earth below was giving its 55-degree warmth. The snow above was holding that warmth in. The thick, sod walls were gently radiating the heat they had stored earlier in the day. Ilara was not huddled in fear. She was on the floor, drawing pictures on a piece of slate. Lars sat at his small wooden table, mending a piece of harness by the steady, calm light of a kerosene lamp. The air was still. The warmth was gentle and pervasive. They were not surviving. They were living. They were in the safest, warmest, quietest place in the entire Dakota Territory. They were in the heart of the storm, yet utterly untouched by it. For 36 hours, the blizzard raged. When it finally broke, the world was remade. A landscape of rolling prairie had become a stark white desert, sculpted into fantastic drifts and dunes by the wind. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the air was so cold it cracked in the lungs. In Providence, the silence was one of shock and grief. The cost had been immense, in livestock and, tragically, in human lives. Silas Croft emerged from his house, his face grim. His woodpile was decimated. One of his barns had been damaged, a section of its roof torn away by the wind. He had lost a dozen head of cattle that had been caught in the open. As he surveyed the devastation, a thought, nagging and persistent, entered his mind. The mad Dane. Jensen. His folly of a house was directly in the path of the storm's worst fury. Croft felt a pang of something he would not have admitted was guilt. He had warned the man. But he had also mocked him, led the chorus of ridicule. The man and his little girl were surely dead, buried under a collapsed roof of mud and snow. He saddled his horse, the animal's breath pluming in the frigid air, and began the difficult ride out to Lars's claim. He told himself he was going to see if he could render aid, perhaps dig for the bodies. But he knew, deep down, he was going to confirm his own wisdom. He was going to see the proof that his methods, though tested, were the only correct way to live in this harsh land. As he crested the last rise, he stopped. He could see nothing. The place where Lars's house should have been was just a large, smooth snowdrift, indistinguishable from the thousands of others that stretched to the horizon. He was right. The house had been completely buried, collapsed, a tomb of ice and earth. He felt a grim, hollow satisfaction. But then he saw it, a thin, almost invisible wisp of gray smoke rising straight up into the still, crystalline air. It was coming from the very center of the snowdrift. It was a sign of life so impossible, so contrary to every law of building and survival he knew, that he simply stared for a full minute, believing his eyes were deceiving him. He urged his horse forward, plunging through the deep snow until he reached the edge of the drift. He dismounted, his legs sinking to the thigh. He waded toward the source of the smoke. There, poking out of the top of the massive drift, was the top few inches of a metal stovepipe, warm to the touch. He followed the slope of the drift down and saw a narrow canyon carved out of the snow. At the bottom of this canyon was a wooden door. He stumbled down into the cleared space. It was unnaturally quiet and still, sheltered from the wind. He hesitated for a moment, his entire worldview tilting on its axis. Then he knocked. The sound was flat and dead in the snow-filled quiet. The door opened. Lars Jensen stood there, wearing a simple woolen shirt, his face calm. Behind him, Croft could see the warm, lamplit interior of the home. He saw the little girl, Ilara, sitting at a table, eating a bowl of porridge. And then he felt it. A wave of warm, stable, gentle air washed over him, a stark contrast to the biting cold at his back. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overworked stove, but a deep, radiant warmth that seemed to come from the very walls. Croft was speechless. He looked past Lars, at the smooth, earthen walls. He saw no signs of collapse, no water, no mud. He saw a home, a sanctuary. Lars looked at him, his eyes holding no triumph, no hint of, "I told you so." He saw a man who was cold and shaken. "Mr. Croft," he said, his voice even, "you look frozen. Come in. There is coffee." Silas Croft, the master builder, the respected authority, the man who had named this place a folly, stepped out of the biting wind and into the impossible warmth of the sod house. He took off his hat. He looked at the thick earthen walls, the heavy-beamed ceiling, the peaceful child. He reached out a hand and placed it on the wall. It was not icy cold like the logs of his own house. It was cool, but it held a latent, living warmth. It felt solid. It felt eternal. In that moment, he did not understand the physics of thermal mass or the insulating properties of snow, but he understood the result. He understood that he had been catastrophically, fundamentally wrong. His knowledge was an incomplete book. He finally met Lars's gaze, his own eyes filled with a humility he had never known. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not offer apologies. He asked the only question that mattered. How? That single word was the beginning of a revolution. Lars Jensen shared his knowledge freely, without pride or payment. He spoke not of his own cleverness, but of the principles. He explained how the prairie did not fight the winter, but held its warmth deep and waited for the spring. He taught Silas Croft to see the earth not as a dead foundation upon which to build, but as a living partner in the act of shelter. Croft, to his credit, became Lars's most devoted student. Together, they began to build other houses like it, refining the design. They became known as Jensen houses, or more simply, soddies. They were warm, they were safe, and they required a fraction of the wood and labor of a log cabin. They were the homes that allowed countless families to survive and thrive on the northern plains. Lars Jensen lived out his days on that piece of land, a quiet, respected pillar of the community he had once been cast out of. He never sought praise. His satisfaction came from the sight of other thin wisps of smoke rising from other snow-covered mounds during the hard winters that followed. His legacy was not written in books of history, but in the earth itself, in the quiet, stubborn warmth of the homes that dotted the prairie, a testament to the profound and simple truth he carried from the old world to the new. Fire is not the gift. Heat is the gift. And the greatest wisdom is often found not in conquering nature, but in listening to it. This story is a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters are fictional, and their actions are intended to illustrate principles of resilience and ingenuity. The content herein does not constitute professional architectural, engineering, or survival advice. Always consult with qualified professionals for any building or safety-related matters. What about you? What piece of conventional wisdom do you live by without question? What if the solution to your greatest challenge isn't to fight harder, but to yield smarter? What if the very thing everyone calls a folly is in fact the foundation of your survival.